So, greetings, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this event. We are very, very pleased to have the two panelists for this Yale Career Fireside Chat on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before we start, though, I want to make a couple of comments. First, about this overall program. This whole series of Yale Career Panels and Yale Career Fireside Chats started in April of 2012. And this is actually the 52nd of those events. This is the ninth fireside chat, and we had 42. We've had 42 of the career panels. And the whole purpose, there are really two purposes. One is the career panels. The attempt there is to help people get candid information about various professions, because we all know that the mythology about going to law school or investment banking, whatever, and the facts, they don't match. So we try to get panelists who are willing to be frank and even-handed about both the joys and the challenges of different professions. And these fireside chats are about specific issues, such as how do you get on boards, or how do you do an interview, or how do you network. And this one is around this issue of a very important issue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to thank my three collaborators who the four of us run this program: Justin Coslin, Trish Takemoto, and Julie Son. And the four of us are Yale alumni, and we do this pro bono. And as long as people find it interesting and helpful, we'll continue to do that. I want to particularly thank Trish Takemoto, because actually she was the one who thought of this event and assembled this really wonderful panel. But she asked me to be the moderator. The other thing I want to mention before I introduce is this topic of whole diversity, inclusion, equity. It's always been important, but it's become sort of white hot as an important topic for the last couple of years. And our two panelists here were both chief or head diversity officers in their respective, companies, or in the case of Camelyn, the government. And that role has become very, very important. And I would encourage all of you to read this article that was published, a full-page article that was published in the Financial Times on Monday, September 20th, titled "The Evolution of the Chief Diversity Officer." It's a wonderful article because, and I'm just going to read the front end of it, and it says, "The protests following George Floyd's murder last year forced many businesses to all recognize the shortcomings of diversity and inclusion. The effect was immediate. Research by the Royal Bank of Canada last year showed that 40% of S&P 500 companies discussed diversity policies during their earnings calls in the second quarter of 2020. And this was a huge increase because it was only 6% in the same quarter of the previous year. So it's become a hugely more important topic among corporations. One result of the internal-external debates, and heightened by the growing inequities at work exposed by the pandemic, is that more organizations are appointing a chief diversity officer. And the FBI recruited its first in April. Harvard Business School did so in June. And research by LinkedIn found that the number of people with the title of head of diversity more than doubled worldwide from 2015 to 2020, while the director of diversity title rose 75% and chief diversity officer 68%. So this points out not only that the overall topic of diversity, equity, inclusion has become important, but the management of that within organizations has become an important issue, and the role of the people operating in the diversity offices. But this article does say it's a really tough job. It's a really tough job because identifying and measuring gaps in an organization's, equal opportunities, et cetera, has become very, very difficult, right? And how you tackle the problem and how do you make things better. And one of the last sentences says, but the title is meaningless if an organization's head of diversity has little sway, budget, or clarity of purpose. So I'm sure our two panelists here would agree. But this quote is very good because you should read. All of you should read the whole article. It really tells you, one, how important the topic has become, but also how organizations are trying to get their minds around it. With that, before I'd like to introduce our two panelists. Both of them have a long, long career dealing with the issue of diversity and equity and inclusion. In alphabetical order, Diane Ashley. She's been involved with diversity and recruiting in corporate, nonprofit, and government for over 20 years. Her whole career has been around a passion for translating corporate desire for diversity and inclusion into actionable strategies. She currently is running a consulting firm, DTA Diversity Counts. Before that, she was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's founding chief diversity officer and launched their Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And her unit was really a model for all of the different reserve system banks. And she also, before being at the Federal Reserve of New York, she held various leadership roles at Citibank, essentially around the same issues of diversity and minorities and women, disabled, veterans, etc., on the supply side of Citibank. And she had some pretty amazing results. Camelyn Malalis, I hope I pronounced it correctly, right?
Malalis.
Oh, gosh, and I practiced all morning, right? She was appointed the chair and commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights in November of 2014. And after more than a decade of practice as an advocate for employees' rights in the workplace. And while she was a partner at Otten and Golden, she co-founded and co-chaired their lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender workplace rights practice group, and also co-chaired the diversity, disability, family responsibilities, discrimination practice group, and worked in a lot of legal matters focused on that. But while she's been commissioner, she has really revitalized the agency and making it a recognized venue for justice for all New Yorkers through increased enforcement, novel restorative justice approaches to case and conflict resolution, and robust public education outreach to prevent discrimination in New York City. So I hope all those of you who are in the audience would agree that, Trish Takamoto did a pretty good job in assembling these two panelists. And we're going to go through a number of questions. We're going to conduct this as a fireside chat. We have a number of questions that the panelists and I have agreed to go through, and but we're going to make sure there's time at the end for Q&A. The way you ask question is just use the chat box like in any technology, and just type in your questions, and we'll try to answer them. The fun thing, though, is at the end of this hour, I'm going to magically move all of you into an electronic ballroom. You don't have to do anything. I'll be in control. And what you'll see once you get in the ballroom is you'll see all these tables with seats, and some will be labeled. So actually, our panelists will have their own table. So if you want to talk further with them, you can go to their table. Otherwise, there are a bunch of other tables. And this will just be a fun way for you to meet each other, meet the speakers, or just network other people who are attending. And it's a lot of fun, and we'll do that for about a half an hour. And I think it'll be a way also for you to have a little bit of fun as well. So, but by the way, when you click on a seat, and when you go into the electronic ballroom, it's like you're looking from the top of the ballroom. You see the tables, and they're labeled and who's at seats. If you want to join a table, just click on a chair, and magically you'll be at the table, and you'll see all the people at your table, like a Zoom session. I guess I shouldn't use that word because people are getting tired of Zoom. But anyway, you'll be able to see the people at your table. So with that, let's get started. So I think it's always important to start with at least a definition, because there's so many different ways that people think about these concepts. So I'm going to ask the two panelists, and they can speak in whatever the order they want. What do diversity, equity, and inclusion mean in the workplace? And have those definitions changed over the course of your careers? So either one of you can start first.
Well, I'll start. First of all, let me say thank you to Trish, my classmate, and to Peter and to the group for putting the whole program together. It's always wonderful not only to see, hopefully, former classmates here, certainly those of us all in the profession, and certainly with my dear colleague that I've just met this afternoon, Camelyn. But, you've asked a question which I think is fundamental to the conversation, which is how are employers defining DEI? Because it's a very interesting question, because the second part of your question, Peter, was, has it evolved in the course of your careers? The reason I picked myself first is because I think I'm closer to dinosaur status than Camelyn. So in the earlier classes of women, we've seen this whole area evolve over the last how many decades of years. And I started writing it down. You think about 1964, civil rights era, right? Then you've got this whole term that evolved out of that called affirmative action. Affirmative action morphed into equal opportunity, which then morphed in the 90s to diversity. Then it became diversity and inclusion. Then it became multiculturalism for a little while, but that term apparently wasn't very popular, so it didn't last very long. So then we went from equality to equity, and we're now in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, to answer the short answer to your question is, has it evolved in your career? Absolutely. I would say certainly on some levels. I kind of go back to my French classes and say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, because the more things have changed, the more things have remained the same. However, I will say that, we have seen progress, and it's very exciting. So in terms of the quick answers for diversity, and certainly, Camelyn, you fill in what you feel we need to add. Diversity, in my definition, is really very simple. It just means difference. It means representation of difference, and difference can be in any dimension. What is it? We talk about race and sex more often, LGBT now more often, but disability more often. But we also have things like political background. We have things like weight. We have things hobbies and things like that, the things that make individuals unique and different. That's how I look at it as diversity. So I would argue that everybody on this webinar today has some dimension of diversity. And I think that's something we need to talk about.
Okay. Camelyn?
Sure. And again, I too would like to thank, Trish for putting us all together. Diane, I don't know how we've managed to not meet each other. So
right.
Hopefully we're now in a space where we are meeting each other. And Peter, thank you so much for moderating this. Always good to start with some baselining, right? And what different terms are. I remember someone once, calling a comparison or definition for me that I think really stuck, and it's an easy way to think about it. So I think of diversity as kind of the what, it's the demographics of the workplace, and inclusion is more the how. How do we keep the workplace in a state or a space so that the diversity that you've now brought into the workplace wants to stay there, and is able to actually succeed. Diane also mentioned, equality, and how kind of equality shifted towards equity. And I think the way that we have changed thinking about these different words and the need for the different realities of the different words is also shaped by the consciousness that certain things are not enough. Diversity is not enough if people keep leaving. You can bring in a diverse demographic of people into your workforce, but if they keep leaving after the first 2 years, something is wrong. How do we fix that? We have to be thinking of inclusion. Equality, great if we're thinking of equality, but if people are at the same level, starting off at the same level, but we're not taking into account whatever, historic or career injustices or inequalities have existed before, so that people are not really at the same level, it's just assuming equality, then we're really not doing what we need. And so that's how I think the idea of equity has come upon.
Yeah. It's interesting, but if you think about it, this is really hard to get your arms around, right? Because there's so many dimensions to this, and it varies so much. But I think we're going to try our best. The next question, I think, has that characteristic, which is really tough to generalize, but you have to do it a little bit in order to try to understand the problem. So what do you think are the most common problems faced by the employees in terms of these issues? Certainly, you can talk about your own experiences, right? Your own organizations and what the employees and I suspect they're not the same if you're talking about, your two respective organizations. So what are the most common problems faced by employees in terms of these, issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Diane, would you like to start, or should you want to turn popcorn around a little
turns,
bit?
right.
Okay.
I'll be second.
So I think, of course, we're talking about different types of diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation, religious diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity. And I think that for different demographics, there are going to be different challenges. If you just look at workforces now and you look at equity numbers, some companies don't even identify some of the groups I've just mentioned as being an area where they need to be thinking about diversity, right? So some of those areas that I think of, religious diversity, still an issue, especially when we think about religious diversity where people of a certain faith also wear garments that make their faith or their belief system visible, right? Transgender and non-binary folks, still very much, we can't even talk about inclusion because they're not even in the workforce, right? We haven't even gotten the diversity there yet. There's so many barriers to trans and non-binary folks actually entering workforces. And then if you look at, I think, other large demographics, and they're by no means monoliths, right? Because people are a combination of different things, like what we think of as now intersectional identities. But if you look at kind of on a general basis, what people think of as racial and ethnic diversity, and certainly gender diversity, if I'm thinking of the binary men and women, that while there have been, accomplishments, I think, in those areas, especially with larger companies who have had the resources to be thinking about these issues for years, I think we're still seeing ways in which inclusion still escapes many people, many companies, and even companies in finance, in law, that I think have been talking about this and leading the kind of call for this for decades. We're still having, Diane probably gets invited to these things all the time, right? We're still having these conversations about getting people in the pipeline and then keeping here. How do we retain? Go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, and by the way, one of the issues is the level within the organization. So part of the problem is how people go from the junior ranks, all the way up to the senior ranks, and there are issues all along the way, right?
At the senior ranks, we're talking unicorns.
Yeah.
And that's a problem, because actually one of the things that I was looking at and researching for this today is the whole notion of, we are still working in a very multi-generational workforce right now. And I know Camelyn kind of intimated that, but when you think about it, certainly organizations, and I can say, I know, Camelyn, you working on the governmental sector, and myself having done it at the Federal Reserve as well, that, it's not unusual to have 2 or 3 generations of the workforce still there. You've got I can remember first starting when I first joined the Fed in 2007, before the financial crisis, we had a number of people who were still in what they call the greater generation, because people historically stayed in the governmental sector and in some of these not-for-profit sectors for several decades. 40, 50 years would not be that unusual in those organizations. And so when you think about it from a diversity perspective, that presents a very interesting challenge for a manager as well as the employee, because those of us who grew up as boomers were motivated, incentivized very differently than the upcoming millennial generation, which, by the way, don't forget, the oldest millennials are turning 40, and the Zs, which are right behind it. So, that's a huge differential right now that we're looking at too within the workplace. You said it very correctly, Peter, when you mentioned that it's become more complex, and that's one of the reasons why the work for leadership is more complex now.
One of the issues is the entry point, right, in jobs. And it's interesting because, if you go back a while, discrimination was overt and it was conscious discrimination, right? So a lot of companies and organizations were purposely not hiring people who were diverse. Then
Right.
It's gotten better, but then you still have the unconscious discrimination, right? That maybe they didn't intend to discriminate, but they discriminate, but they're not conscious. And then there at the other end is, even if you get past that, there's still a systemic issues too, which, for example, mentorship is very important, but you've got this catch-22, which is, if you have no mentors who are African American or at the top, they can't mentor the people below. So you got to put pressure on people who are already at the top to mentor people who are not part of their ethnic group or diversity. So it's that kind of transition. So any comments about this kind of evolution of the conscious, unconscious bias, and then the systemic bias that seems to prevail in the entry level, right? Let's just start with the entry level.
Well, I think the unconscious bias is an issue that is, pervasive to everyone. And it doesn't matter where you work, what industry, what level you are, but you want to talk about it from an entry level perspective. I mean, again, I think one of the questions you had asked us previously was to think about it, does it begin even before you come into the workplace? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because, the fundamentals of unconscious bias is unconscious biases are created in your development, from your neurological development of the brain. And basically they were put in place as ways to help defend against what you saw as danger. So you grew up in a particular community or in a family network, and you're told don't go around the corner because there's going to be bad people around there. And so you kind of grow up and create a culture and a habit around fearing certain organizations or certain people or certain situations because they are going to be threatening to you. That's what the basis of unconscious bias is. And it's not necessarily that people are biased intentionally in a negative way. What I like to tell people is that we all have unconscious biases. The issue is, how do you bring them to the workplace? And some of the unconscious bias, frankly, that your family or your situation were in aren't particularly helpful in the workforce. And so, I recommend very much for people to look into things, Peter, such as the implicit association test, IAT. It's free. I would recommend for anyone here watching today to take it. It was put together by the Harvard Negotiation Project, and there's a wonderful professor that I've heard several times, Professor Mahzareen Banaji, who, by the way, is a Yale graduate, teaching at Harvard.
Who I will also say was one of my Yale professors.
I love
fantastic. All right.
She's fabulous. And she does a wonderful lecture there on this, and we find that it's been terrifically helpful in terms of identifying that unconscious bias basically is, and the issue is, what are you doing with it in the workplace?
Camelyn, your comments?
Diane covered a lot of it already. I think what I would caution, though, against thinking that we're beyond just straight up discrimination and bias.
Right.
So the Commission on Human Rights, my agency, we basically are the city agency that enforces all the anti-discrimination and anti-harassment protections throughout New York City. Employment, housing, public accommodations, both with private and public entities, right? And from this perch, let me say that, trust me, that there are still many instances of discrimination and harassment that are overt, that cannot be simply minimized as microaggressions. We can't really say that what's behind them is just, implicit bias or unconscious bias. And so I think that, I think because the idea of implicit bias and unconscious bias has been now introduced, it's something that we need to be thinking of in addition to, right, the fact that there is still quite overt forms of racism and homophobia and transphobia and you name it, xenophobia in different spaces.
I think that's absolutely true, and I couldn't agree more. And I think, it's one thing I was hoping you would kind of define. You said microaggressions, and I think not everyone may be familiar with the term. So why don't you go ahead and give a little definition of that?
So I will say this about microaggressions. I think people think, because I actually take issue with the idea of microaggressions. I think that it dismisses some of what goes on. So I think people generally think of as microaggressions as kind of the things that happen, the normalized things that happen kind of on the day-to-day that have the effect of diminishing people, making people, because of various identity issues or various issues or identity characteristics, make people feel unwelcome or marginalized or not as valued in different spaces or in workplaces, since we're talking about workplaces. And sometimes people think of things like misgendering people as being a microaggression, or referring in denigrating ways to somebody's heritage or religion or race as being microaggressions in the workplace. I tend to think of those things as just kind of straight up, discriminatory or biased acts, because they're not micro to the people who are experiencing them. I mean, I've also heard people talking about acts of sexual harassment as being microaggressions in some instances, and certainly know that they were not experienced in any micro way by the person who was the target of them. But Diane, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly agree with you. I think the issue too that we need to bring up to this table is the issue of entitlement.
Yep.
And I think that, that I think has fueled a lot of what kind of has gotten thrown into this unconscious bias conversation. But at the end of the day, entitlement simply means that, you may have grown up in a particular economic status, right, or cultural status, and you're not even aware of your effect on others. You make presumptions about things and expect people probably to think the same way that you do. And there's a presumption also that the way you think is actually the best way to think. And so I think these create other issues. And I'll go back to a very visual example that I will not forget from 2020, which was a story in New York City around Amy Cooper and Chris Cooper, not related. She was the white woman in Central Park, and she was walking her dog, and Central Park has a rule, you need to have your dog on a leash, and she did not. Chris Cooper is a black male who was in the park, and he's a bird watcher. He was photographing birds, and apparently her dog started getting out of control, and he said, please leash your dog, and she said no, and she proceeded to pick up her phone and call 911 and call the police and say a black man was harassing her. So, what's interesting about that story is that when her company got wind of it, they fired her the next day immediately, which I don't know necessarily if that was the right thing to do, but I would certainly say it's a very acute example of when entitlement gets in the way, because she just made a presumption that the police would take her side and that there would be no other problem and no other recourse for her. So it was an issue.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll just say, for purposes of transparency, that case is actually under investigation by my agency.
Yeah. Well, Camelyn,
I didn't know that.
Camelyn, given the scope of what your mission is, you've got a very busy staff, right?
Yes, incredibly. We have a small but very busy staff.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and actually it's kind of interesting because I guess both of you referred to this in a sense that there are some differences based on industry and the type of organization, mm-hmm. whether it's government or non-government or whatever. Do you want to comment on that? Do you see any differences that are sort of helpful to think about, right? In terms of different industries, ones that either do, or organizations, like government organizations that either do a better job or do a worse job around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diane, should I start off?
Sure. Well, aligned with what you said earlier in your FT article, right? The very first thing and the most consistent thing you must have if you want to move D&I or DE&I forward is a CEO who is a relentless advocate for it. Not a one and done, once a year, check the box. You must have senior executives who are his or her direct reports who feel the same way. You've got to have that. And then from there, you've got to cascade it down and go in two directions. I always say you need to have bottoms up and top down working at the same time. So I would certainly say that, that's an issue that we see hopefully starting to evolve in a greater way. You asked a little bit about the CEO too. It's funny, when I was researching again, I went back to the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, and the CEO pledge, which has actually been signed on by over 2,000 signatories of CEOs in the United States. It was kind of launched by Tim Ryan at PwC. But is where CEOs have actually made a pledge that they were going to commit their organizations to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm really not bypassing your question, but in the research, and I would ask Camelyn if she has found this as well. When I took a look and wanted to find out whose organizations are best and worst in class, right? You can find best in class in all industries. You can find worst in class in all industries. That's why I'm saying it depends on the leadership more than I think a company per se. Because, for example, if you want to look at Refinitiv, which is the company that does the Fortune 500 measure up data analysis for the Fortune 500 along the lines now of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that, by the way, is new. Fortune 500 never did that before. But if you take a look at the really ground down data, it shows Microsoft is number one. And I found that fascinating because Microsoft has been called out a number of times for diversity, equity, and inclusion infractions. So my point is, I think it has to do where leadership is, whether it's a software, cybersecurity, high-tech environment, pharmaceutical, manufacturing, financial services. Financial services also turn up on the top 20 very often, but then they've had their individual issues as well. So
yeah, I can say that.
It depends on the leadership in the organization.
Yeah. And I'll make one comment and then turn it over to
sure.
And that is, you're absolutely right, which is it's hard if the people at the top don't believe in the cause. But I think I want to make one distinction too, and that is there may be CEOs who believe in the cause because they personally believe in it, and there are others who may just because they feel they'll be, legally liable or whatever. And so I think one of the challenges, for boards of directors when they choose CEOs is how to choose wisely on this dimension. And It's so easy for them to say, oh, this guy got results. He improved revenue by 15% per year. And he's not so good at people, whatever. And that's a challenge because often the boards are faced with a choice, in terms of these issues. And sometimes they don't choose wisely, right? Camelyn?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's nearly impossible to do it if you don't have buy-in at the top. I'm waiting for someone to write the book about some of the most public, gaffes that we've seen with companies, either releasing different products or the way that they've depicted people in commercials or the way that they've depicted merchandise being, objectifying a specific group or denigrating a specific. I'm waiting for someone to kind of write the book on the story behind that. Because in so many of those situations, right, people assume that, wow, how many people had to have approved this for this to actually hit where it was? And the reality for folks of us who know is that in many of those instances, there are people throwing their bodies against it, saying, you cannot do this. This is a terrible idea. There are people up the chain that are saying, don't do this. This is a horrible idea. This will offend however many people. But if there are people on the top who say, I don't care what you think. This is what I want to do. This is what I believe is the right thing, regardless of what everyone else is telling me, regardless of what my D&I person is telling me to do, and goes to market with it, it still happens. But I hear that all the time. I hear people saying, how many people had to say yes to this? And in my mind, I think one person with power. Yeah. So it is incredibly important that there is buy-in at the top. Peter, you mentioned earlier that, I think in reading my bio, that our office has engaged in more restorative justice methods of dealing with discrimination and harassment, not just, fines and penalties. And one of the ways that we've been dealing with it, especially when we're looking at different companies where there is the possibility of repeated acts of discrimination or harassment because people are not thinking or not invested with the power to, to say no to something that could be a very bad idea, is we've said that they have to create positions. They have to create positions that report directly to the CEO, that are actually empowered to take the necessary steps. If they see that there are employment-related policies that are not equitable, if they see that there is marketing or merchandise that is, again, offensive to the public for XYZ reasons, or denigrating specific groups, but there has to be that buy-in at the very top, or these things don't have to work, because there's always that one person who can say, I don't care what all of the quote unquote experts or the people who are invested with this title say, we're still going to do this. And that works for policies and everything.
So
Yeah,
can
and
I
you can
just
have
add?
you can have
Right.
policies all day long,
Right.
but if you don't behave in accordance with your principles, people, they'll see that, right? And if you promote people who, and it's clear that attitudes about diversity inclusion were ignored when someone was promoted, people would ignore what you say, because they say it's what you do, it's not just what you say, right? Diana?
Yeah, I was just going to actually kind of say two things. Your comment kind of made me think of two things. One is going back to your FT article, Peter, probably what they should have done, and this goes right to what you just said about perhaps not the right people in the room. They should have said empowered CDOs, because along the way in my 2.5 decades of doing this work, I've seen plenty of CDOs who are well-intentioned, but they were 6 layers down.
Yep.
And so you've got an individual who probably is trying his or her best. Oftentimes it's her, trying his or her best and not being able to get past first or second base because they don't have the level of influence within the organization, so they can't be effective.
Let me ask this question then. It actually, Diane, it's a perfect segue to the next question, which is, each of you are leading. You were leading, diversity inclusion efforts, Diane. Camelyn, you're doing the whole thing for the, for the government. What are the things that you have done, sort of the 4 or 5 things that you've done to help the people in your organization? And Camelyn, I'm now going to say the people work for you as opposed to, protecting people in housing, et cetera. What are the kinds of things that you've done to help the problem? But also the other question is, what are things you just felt frustrated because you're not the CEO and some things, leverage you just don't have, that you just can't do, you couldn't do? Either one. Camelyn, you want to start and just say, because you run an organization, so obviously part of it is diversity, equity, inclusion within your organization, right?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, since we are the agency that enforces human rights protections, in my mind, coming in, one of the things we had to make sure is that we had staff capable of actually communicating with and connecting with a diversity of communities that we have here in New York City. So, coming in, one of my huge priorities was getting a more representative workforce. I think the historical norm is to have folks who are not terribly widely culturally competent in government. And that is why historically it is very challenging to get people from communities that are oftentimes targeted by discrimination and harassment to come forward, right? Terrible histories of over-policing or over-surveillance in some communities. In other communities, especially immigrant communities, they may be coming from spaces where government is actually the foremost oppressor in their situation.
Right, exactly.
So creating trust between government and the public is incredibly important. For us, that meant making sure that as we expand, and we had great expansion in the past, 6+ years that I've been here, we went from a staff of 55 to a staff of 160. And most of my staff speak languages in addition to English. It's very difficult to get a job at my office if you don't speak a language in addition to English.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Because again, we have to connect with the public. We have to be thinking about who we're serving and how we can remove barriers to people coming forward. I think what that inherently does for the agency is it creates the sort of diversity and inclusion. I mean, we're forcing each other to be more inclusive in some ways because we have to walk the walk internally, right?
Yeah.
So some of the workshops and trainings that we do for the public that I think on the outside people think of as like cultural competency type workshops, and working with people who are trans and non-binary, understanding the diversity of Muslim communities, understanding Sikhism or Sikhi and Judaism, and working with immigrant communities. Those are all things that internally my staff have to complete as well. They're mandatory for my staff because we cannot expect that they will be able to appropriately deal with the public on these issues if they're offending the public, or if they're not inclusive of their staff mates, the other people on our staff. So representation in government has been incredibly important for us.
Yeah. Diane, and now when you were at the Fed, New York Fed,
Mm-hmm.
what are the kinds of things you did to try to improve the performance within the New York Fed?
I think the first thing was walking into an institution, as you had said, Camelyn, that was kind of quasi-governmental and really didn't have a handle, understanding, trust, et cetera, experience in diversity and inclusion. When I walked in, there was kind of a mistaken, I think, notion that diversity, equity, and inclusion was really something that was relegated for people of color and women, period, the end. So we had to go in and really create a mindset and a strategy around expanding that understanding so that you could build trust, mutual respect, and demonstrate that there is a business imperative as well as a business upside by really including more people in the workforce as part of the decision making. So one of the first things that we did is create employee engagement and employee resource networks. We went from 0 to 10. And by the time I left the bank, more than 50% of the bank were at some level members of one of the 10 employee networks. The beauty of the employee networks, and I will say I love them and I crow about them all the time, is that we had the traditional, African American, Latino, Asian American group, LGBT group, disabilities group, but we also had groups like parents. We had groups that dealt with people that work the third shift. No, I've heard not one of my colleagues around the country talk about issues around individuals who work the third shift, the night shift, because their career issues are different. They have higher levels of injury, et cetera, et cetera. But we had 10. And the beauty of that is that was a group that were primarily led by junior people. So what does that do? That gives junior people an opportunity to have a platform to increase their management expertise. They had to work in concert with senior management because they were the executive sponsors for the group. The group was responsible. We had guardrails for them. So they really created business-related projects. And our model, as you said in my introduction, really did become the other model that the other 11 banks kind of adapted. When Dodd-Frank was passed in 2010 with a mandate to stand up the offices in 2011 for all the Federal Reserve and all the financial regulator offices, agencies, we had to create a council for the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, because that officer, that director, needed to be appointed by the president of each one of the Federal Reserve banks. And so we had to create a system-wide council. And so I was one of the charter members of that. And I think that's another way that we help to, quote unquote, spread the word. The other thing, and I can't, emphasize enough, is the importance and the power of exposure. It's kind of interesting, Peter. My mother used to say, if you don't have exposure to something, you'll never know to ask the question, right?
Yeah.
So we created a world-class speaker program, speaker series, and brought people in from all walks of life who were celebrities, luminaries, et cetera. And part of it was to bring to this population, which frankly, before the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve was very insular. It was, people didn't hear much about the Federal Reserve. All you heard about the Federal Reserve was, the interest rates are going up and down, unless you were an economist or you were deeply in the financial sector. So this, and with the crisis, let me tell you that, I'll speak about it in 2 minutes. Working at the New York Fed during 2008, 9, and 10 was a unique privilege and challenge, because the organization, as particularly in your world, Peter, in the investment side, was going through a whole series of challenges and crises on a daily basis. And so most Americans don't have a clue of how close to the edge we actually became economically when the stock market's going down 500 points every day. It became a very interesting challenge. How do you navigate increasing diversity and inclusion, a mindset around that when everybody's preoccupied with the crisis? And part of how we were able to do it, and I do give a lot of credit to the leadership at the bank, is that, when that question came, and it came from several sides, well, do you think we should pause diversity and inclusion now because, we're so busy with the crisis? The answer that came back I had said was absolutely not, because people are watching, and they're watching what the organization's going to do, not when everything's going great, but times like this. And so that was not turned down. I continued getting my funding. We continued building our programs. But let me tell you, it was, and Camelyn, I know you know that becomes a real conversation that, we don't talk about enough in this world, because if you want to do this work, you have to not only be passionate, but darn it, you've got to be courageous, because there will be times when you're going to have to take a stand and you're not going to be popular.
See, that leads, you talked about the financial crisis, so it leads to one of our next questions, which is, to what extent has the pandemic influenced the trajectory of progress on diversity, equity, inclusion? Did it slow it down? I mean, I know the pandemic disrupted a lot of things, and particularly in the workplace.
Yeah.
It really made it very tough for people to get to know each other.
Right.
To be a new hire at a company was a nightmare, because it's kind of hard to establish relationships with people if you're stuck at your home in front of a monitor, so forth. So maybe, Camelyn, if you could start and just saying, what's your perception of the impact that the pandemic, which is still going on, right?
I was going to say, Peter, I think we're not really going to see the impact. We're still in it. Yeah, and there are very many workplaces that are still remote.
Yeah.
So, some of those issues that you were just talking about, we're not going to see the after effects, I think, of this for probably a few years. I think that the pandemic did a great job, though, of uncovering a lot of longstanding historical inequities in different spaces. One of the ways in which I think a broader slice of the workforce were able to understand a different group through the pandemic was when we're talking about caregivers. Diane was speaking before about the third shift folks, people who, oftentimes are not included in these conversations. But I would also put out there caregivers are oftentimes not put out there, whether they are caring for minors in their household or they're caring for elderly folks. When I was still in private practice, there were times when pregnancy or caregiving related discrimination accounted for a third of my docket, because it was so rampant.
Right.
And I think what we are seeing more and more, as there's an opening, but not a full opening, and it's staggered in different places, we're seeing ways in which, caregivers, largely women, right, are being affected because they're not able to continue doing the work and also providing the child care or also providing the elderly care. I think it's been a big issue, especially in, for public employees in different spaces that are trying to manage continuing to do their work as the workforces are coming back, in person.
Mm-hmm.
But now, that has not necessarily been matched with childcare or what they're doing in that realm. So I think we're just starting to see how the pandemic has really affected folks. My hope early on was that it would make a solid case for telework, that we would see why telework and different types of work relationships, made sense, and why different industries should be embracing these different types of flexible work arrangements in their spaces. I think some folks are, and we're seeing that in some industries. That's fantastic. But for some other industries, it's been, back to business as usual. They might not be in the office right now, but they're announcing, back in the office, as it was pre-pandemic by end of October or by January.
Yeah. But do you think the pandemic and this work at home thing has increased the diversity, equity, inclusion problem, or been neutral or helped? I mean, there are a lot of different theories about it, about that around there. Any opinion about that, has it set back? I know for some industries, it set back a whole lot of things related to people and human resources, right? They don't consider, I think most companies I know, and I work with a lot of CEOs and so forth, the companies, they say that the pandemic has not had very many positives that come out, right? Around human relations and progress and training and so forth. But is that your feeling, both of you, that it's had a net negative effect on progress in terms of the diversity and equity inclusion issue?
See, I don't think it has had a net negative effect. I think it's been the source of major disruption. And I would argue that I thought, frankly, we were getting to a point before 2019. And I have to tell you just anecdotally, Peter, I've changed my language around time differently because, just as we say in the calendar, BC before Christ AD, I'm calling it BC before coronavirus, right? So 2019 BC, things were really very different in terms of the whole look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was frankly at that point really concerned because it was starting to slide back in terms of priority at many companies, talking to many of my peers. So, 2020's gift, I guess on some level you could say, was the coronavirus first, unemployment, and that threw everybody off the rails. And then all of a sudden, we weren't planning on this, but we had to figure out how are we going to survive this. And so everybody had to become very, very savvy. Even people who really were not technology oriented had to understand how to use at least Zoom, for example, right? Then we had people who became unemployed, and what that has yielded has been an incredible number of new entrepreneurs. Part of what I think the articles that I've seen coming out now is what they're calling the Great Resignation, which are people that are coming out of the pandemic and saying, you know what, I don't want this corporate stuff anymore. I'm going to start my own company. So we've had a big upside.
And primarily women, just to interject.
Yes,
and primarily
women. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right. And the death of George Floyd, how horrible was that day? But what did that do? That kind of, interestingly enough, a person, and this shows to me again, why we always kind of mock how one person can't make a difference. That is one person who was not known, and his name became instantaneously known around the world. He sparked a movement. Yes.
I actually, although I think we'd agreed that the pandemic was supposed to be a part of the question, I'll be honest with you, I think the bigger problem the last 3 to 4 years has been the acceleration of hate, racial hate, racial division. Right. I mean, look, as an Asian American, this hate Asian American thing is a serious problem. To be honest with you, I think those things and the greater, racial divisions, et cetera, have probably had more of a negative effect on diversity, equity, inclusion than the pandemic. Do you agree?
I think it certainly has infected your group specifically in a way.
More than that.
Never been. No, but let me say this.
George Floyd is not a pandemic issue.
No, it's not a pandemic issue, but it is indirectly being blamed. Your group is being blamed for part of the pandemic. That's why I'm saying I think that it has been a lightning rod for people to understand that you cannot blame a group of people, whether you're a Jewish group of people, an African American group of people, a Latino group of people. I mean, we're seeing the same thing going on in some respect around the immigration conversation. So I think that, what these kinds of identifying crises do is they galvanize people to really start to think outside of their own world and outside of their own box.
I'm trying to get away from the pandemic because I think most of the racial tension things that are affecting the U.S. today about white supremacy and so forth, they're not pandemic related. And, maybe Asian American.
I mean, the pandemic doesn't help it, though.
No, it doesn't help. But I was trying to switch and to stop talking about pandemic.
Yeah.
We weren't fixated on pandemic, but we went back to pandemic.
The pandemic is just
about
heightened.
The question really was not how can we relate everything back to the pandemic. Is this heightened racial tension, so forth, has it hurt the efforts to create more diversity, equity, inclusion? Because clearly we have a much more heightened racial tension today than we had 4 years ago, right?
I mean, just addressing the increases in anti-Asian racism and violence. I mean, the reality is, I mean, and Peter, right? We're both Asian American, and Diane, I don't know, perhaps you are too, but you know, we've always experienced anti-Asian racism, right? I mean, what's been so interesting in the past, you know, few months is when I've been at, you know, different forums or venues, and we're talking about anti-Asian racism. We're all recalling experiences from our youth of being called certain epithets, or people making fun of our parents' accents, or whatever it is, different things, right? Being called, those things haven't changed, and that has been the case for decades. We've always experienced this. I think what the pandemic changed and what we saw, it was heightened violence, actual physical violence accompanying that racism. But the issue for me was that racism has always existed. And why is it still there? Why are the stories that I tell as a 47-year-old the same that are told by a 7-year-old who's going to school in New York City? That's a huge problem. That indicates that there are just, again, baseline, basic issues in understanding, in education, that form the basis of our beliefs of entitlement that have not changed, right? Why was it that when I was a child, you know, if kids were upset with me, they would call me a ching chong. If they were upset with somebody else, they'd call them a jerk, right? Because baseline things were couched in ways or experiences of difference to other people. And I think that this very much ties into the ideas that we're talking about in workforces of diversity, equity, inclusion, because if someone at the end of the day feels like they are not welcome at whatever point in time, they can be thrust out there as the other, they're never going to feel like they can be a part of that institution, or that they could be a part of the leadership of that institution. So I feel like they are different issues, but they connect, because at the heart of inclusion, when we're talking about inclusion in different workforces, you're trying to create a culture where people feel like they belong, where people feel like they can't be othered. Like if someone was angry, if someone was upset, the lowest possible denominator would not be about their race or their religion or their sexuality or their gender. And that, I think, is what we're trying to move towards when we talk about inclusion. We're still seeing that this is very much part of the ether in schools and in public. That's what, to me, the anti-Asian racism and acts of violence means. It's still out there. But if we're talking about how we create safe places, we have to be thinking about, like, what are those ideas learned from when we were very young? What are those ideas of entitlement, you know, that Diane was talking about, that really have to be stripped away, so that's not part of the natural ether?
So last question, and oh, by the way, the reason why I didn't stop for Q&A is, for some reason, no one has, I've been looking, and no one has printed any questions. There's just one comment from someone said, "I'm sorry, I have to leave early," but I decided that wasn't a question. So I'm going to continue the discussion until we reach the end. So last question is really this: is there hope for the future for us to get to the point where these kinds of things go away? And I'm an optimist by nature, but I also can point to some cases where certain groups that were racially discriminated were treated, you know, like immigrants before. Then that went away. You know, I mean, let's face it, the Irish and the Germans, they were treated like, you know, name the groups that are being discriminated now. And then they ultimately, that went away, but then it passed to a different group. So it is possible for certain things to disappear. But are the two of you hopeful that the future, what the future will like in terms of progress towards reaching a really good place with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
See, I'm like you, Peter. I'm a glass half full person. I think you can't work in this field unless you are a glass half full person. And I am hopeful. I think part of what's going to happen and started to evolve is as we move some of the people who have been the worst, how shall I say, blockers to diversity and inclusion initiatives are taken out of the workforce, are aging out, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we'll hopefully be able to evolve into a little bit more of an inclusive work environment and culture. I think the other thing too is, now that we have actually research in McKinsey's 2014 and 2018 studies on diversity, equity, and inclusion speak to how it's, hands down, companies that have invested in and are committed to DEI are in fact more profitable than companies that are not. So we've got a business case now for it as well. So I think that, hopefully companies are optimistic that if they put this investment in time and in their people and in recruitment and talent development, I think that they're going to see that you won't have the conversations and you won't have some of the slip-ups that Camelyn was talking about earlier from companies in an array of industries who have made terrible flubs because they didn't have persons at the table or they weren't paying attention to people at the table who had a different voice.
Yeah.
And I think I just want to say this around that, because I think if you talk about somebody like Scott Page, Professor Scott Page at University of Michigan, he wrote a very interesting book years ago called The Difference. And he's an economist. He's not a diversity practitioner. But we had him come to the bank, and reason for Kamala. He is an economist, and I wanted to have someone who could talk about difference from an economist's perspective. He spoke their language. But what he did do is he took some scientific studies and put a group of people who were similar thinking, homogenous thinking, around a group of individuals who were different in their thinking. And of course, the group that ended up with the array of diversity around their thinking ended up with better results. I think if you continue to have more of these kinds of examples, hopefully that will be but one source. I mean, obviously, this is a huge macro issue, but that will hopefully be something that will start to lead us toward thinking in a more holistic way.
Yeah. Last word to Camelyn and on this issue. And by the way, one other area which is a hot area is focused on the same thing, which is ESG, right?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about
that. There's the same argument that's saying
we're out of time.
Will you end up with better results if you have better ESG practices? So you have the last word, Camelyn, and take a minute or two on this issue of what does the future look like in your view?
I think that we will continue to make progress, but I think sadly it is human nature that people like to kind of label other people and distinguish themselves from people. As I say to my 8-year-olds, unfortunately, there's always people who think that the way of filling their own bucket is by dipping into your bucket, right? So I think that will unfortunately be the case. I think, though, what is nice is that because there is a recognized business need for it and business gratification for it, I do think that we now finally have more structures in place and positions like what Diane has been in the past, where it's recognized that there is a need to be looking at this. Yeah. I think still too often we are looking at stagnant categories, or businesses are looking at stagnant categories and saying how do we fix X, rather than thinking to themselves like, who's not in the room? It's one thing to bring in, as Diane was saying before, it's one thing to bring in speakers on a particular topic, and that's great for exposure, and that's great for getting people thinking on things. But companies also have to, ask themselves or cross-examine their own space and think, why do we have to bring speakers in for this? Like, why don't we have people who look like this or talk like this or have this background in our own work environment? And I think I think in a very positive way, we're going to continue to think about who's not included. Whether that's a caregiver, whether that's in some cases people with criminal history, whether that's people of specific religions or gender identities. So I am positive, but I'm measured. My positive.
So with that, I want to thank both of our two speakers for doing an excellent job and I certainly feel I learned a lot more about what's going on and what can be done. Now, for just two things. One is we have in the future, we have the Yale career panels on venture capital and private equity. That'll be coming up. And the other is we'll probably have one on healthcare services and products as well. So with that, I'm going to remind everyone that I'm magically going to click on a button here. And if it works well, all of you will be in a electronic ballroom and you can sit wherever you wish. And I just remind our panelists to click on the white arrow at the top, that otherwise you will never get into the ballroom. So thank you all, and we'll see you in the ballroom.